Sustainability webinar hosted by Australia Council for the Arts. My name is Beatrice and I'm a facilitator and producer, and I am a woman in my 30s. I have dark hair with a blonde tinge, and today I'm wearing a dark blue turtleneck with some blue flowers. And today's session, we are talking about funding a safe climate future and sponsorship and funding within the arts, and really having a conversation around how that is linked to the climate crisis. I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm standing on the unceded lands of the Kaurna people and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge First Nations people all around Australia and the world who have really been the first caretakers of country and also the first resistors to the climate crisis, and far too often really on the front lines of change. So today I am very excited to be joined by Alex Kelly, Munkara, Kelli McCluskey, and Eliki Reade and Lana Nguyen. And in a moment, I will hand to our speakers to introduce themselves in a bit more detail. But some quick notes before we dive in. Today's session is one of 3 sustainability webinars that has been hosted over the last couple of weeks. Last week, we were talking about energy, and the week before that, we were talking about the power and potency of storytelling. So those 2 recordings are now on the website if you would like to check them out. And this session is also being recorded and Auslan interpreted by Alisa and Sean. And we will have a little bit of time at the end of the session for some Q&A. So if anyone would like to ask our wonderful speakers a question, please pop it in the chat and hopefully we'll have some time for that at the end. So before we get started, I will hand to our speakers to introduce themselves, starting with Alex Kelly.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I'm wearing a hot pink jumper and some fabulous yellow earrings that say "No fracking way" and have a short blonde bob. I'm a woman in my 40s, joining you from Dja Dja Wurrung country. This land is called Upside Down Country by local First Nations people to account for the terraforming that the gold mining here did to the land. And it's a really powerful place to live because you're living with the very visible impacts of colonisation and also the visible impacts of regeneration and cultural resistance at the same time. I'm a filmmaker, I work in documentary. I've also worked a lot in theatre, and I have a speculative futures practice called The Things We Did Next. I've also worked a lot as a community organiser, particularly on environmental and social justice campaigns, mostly in solidarity with First Nations people around uranium mining and different extractive projects, and most recently around fracking in the Northern Territory. I'm really delighted to be here in such good company. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Alex. I'll now pass over to Kelly.
Hi, everyone. Yes, lovely to be here. My name is Kelli McCluskey. I'm Chief Executive Artist of an art group who have been around for around 25 years called PVI Collective. We make participatory performances and public interventions with a social justice edge. We like to think of it as good trouble making. I am a white woman in her 50s with short, dirty blonde hair, and I'm wearing a big smile on my face. Thank you very much for having me. I'm zooming in from Burulu, from the unceded lands of Whadjuk Noongar people.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, over to you, Marie.
Oh, there I am. Hi, I'm Marie Munkara, and I'm speaking to you today from Larrakia country. I live at Waggat Beach, the other side of Darwin Harbour, and right near the beach, right here in the bush, and it's absolutely beautiful. I'm a writer. I write books. I've written 5 books. I'm working on my 6th. I write film scripts. I write TV series. And I'm currently writing a thesis for my PhD, so that's fun. I'm a climate activist. I've always been fascinated by sea level rise and climate stuff, and I've incorporated that into my master's, and I'm doing that for my PhD as well. And I've been involved with the dirty business with Santos off the Tiwi Islands, where I have family, with the filthy gas pipeline. What do I look like? Oh goodness, I look like me. What else do I look? I'm wearing a white shirt today, and I have my mermaid tail red earrings on, which I think are fabulous. I wear them all the time. I think I'm the old one in this group. I'm in my 60s, and I feel like I'm 21 still. And yeah, like that other lovely lady before, I'm wearing a smile as well. So it's so wonderful to be here. I feel like I'm sitting and walking among giants today. What a day this is going to be. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. I'll hand over to Eliki and Lana now, that are both zooming in on the one screen. Hi, guys.
Hey, Sanyandra. Oh no, good afternoon, I mean to say. My name is Eliki. I am currently wearing a bright orange beanie and very proudly wearing a jumper sporting the Fijian Drua, which is the national rugby union team for Fiji. Not the national, sorry, but they represent us in the Super Rugby team. I have light brown skin, a scruffy-ish shadow of a beard, and a short afro growing underneath. And I wear a gold septum ring on my face. And I work as an interdependent producer, artist, and in the realm of advocacy. I'll hand it over to Lana, who's sitting next to me.
Hi everyone, my name's Lana. We're both here on Wurundjeri country. I have choppy brown hair. My ancestors are sort of linked to Vietnam and England and Scotland and Germany, and I'm wearing a grey jumper and also a smile on my face. And yeah, I'm coming today as a co-instigator of the Climate for Art, which is a project that Eliki and I have worked on for a while. And I also work as an independent producer and curator and collaborate on lots of projects, particularly around place-based practice.
Okay.
Great, thank you guys. So we have a wonderful mix of speakers today, and I think, we all now know that we are facing an environmental and biodiversity crisis that is going to require huge changes and a whole all hands on deck approach to really turning things around. I think in our sector and more broadly, it is often kind of overwhelming or hard to know where to start. So that's what this webinar series is really hoping to do, is help to start these conversations and build awareness and capacity, as well as provide resources and tools and links on how we can work together on making those changes. And today we're talking about funding and sponsorship and money in the arts, and why that's so important as far as an action linked to taking climate or environmental action. I'm sure some people or most people dialing in today might be aware of the impact that, where our money goes as far as super and banks and the link to fossil fuel industries, but also in the arts, the logos of these big extractive industries and the sports world actually sneak into our stadiums. They're at our major arts organisations, they're in galleries, and these connections are very broad and wide. So it's a complex topic. It's a complex conversation, but it's really a conversation about what does that mean for our industry? How do we move forwards together and really come towards a place of collective action on these shared challenges that are quite complex and tricky? So it's kind of also a conversation about highlighting the organisational power that we all have in driving these changes. We're also going to round out the conversation with some really accessible and meaningful ways that we can take action in this space, and what that might look like in your practice. I think I'd like to acknowledge that this will look different for everyone, and it's by no means a finger pointing exercise. It's really about coming together on change. So to kick us off and provide a bit of context and really kind of set the scene for this issue and this topic of conversation, I'd love to start with you, Alex. You've done a lot of work in this space, and I'd love you to kind of just give us a bit of context and some information to kick things off.
Awesome, thank you. I guess I would also say it's kind of like, probably for most people doing climate activism, it's kind of reluctant work. I'd rather be making art or working on other projects, but I think, you know, we know that to respond to the challenges of the climate crisis, we need to transform everything, and that means every single sector has to do some heavy lifting. And so really it was through coming to know Liberate Tate and people in the UK working on campaigns to divest BP from cultural institutions there that I started to become aware of art washing and pay more attention to what was happening on this continent. I was reading an article just 2 weeks ago that said that global gas emissions are at an all-time high. And it just seems brain bending that we're burning more coal and gas and oil right now, even though it feels like we've been talking about climate change. And I know for some people we've been talking about climate change for 40 years. So really it's this question of like, why? Like, how are these companies still getting away with it? Why are we still burning fossil fuels? We know that they are heating up the planet, and we know we can't survive on a heated planet. And Mel Evans wrote a book called Art Wash, Big Oil and the Arts. And in it, she says, how is it that there is a gap between all the harmful impacts that companies like BP have through their daily activities around the world and our acceptance of them as part of our lives? A big part of what happens in that gap, Mel calls art wash. This is the way that companies project a better image of themselves in the public through their associations with cultural institutions and sport. And this is called a social license to operate. So an environmental license or a legal license is something that is a bit more institutional and is something that you can look at a checklist for. A social license exists in a cultural space, and therefore it is much more easy to contest, and it's much harder to tick off. It's not just something that you get your building license and you can put something up. A social license is contestable, and it is something that is won in the narrative and cultural space. And this is one of the reasons why the arts are so popular with fossil fuel companies. However, what's interesting, because often I think when we've been having this conversation in Australia in the last few years, people have been feeling nervous, like we're talking about pulling out a whole lot of money, and the question of scarcity and where will we replace that money is sort of one of the first questions. But there's a forthcoming report that's just been put together by Swinburne University. It's called Bad Romance: Coal, Oil and Gas in the Arts. And in the Bad Romance report, they've actually identified that less than 3% of all partnerships in Australia are coming from fossil fuel funding. So there's $200 to $300 million worth of sponsorship in the arts, and a very small percentage of that is coming from the fossil fuel sector. So the interesting thing is here, they get a lot of bang for their buck. They don't put in a lot of money, but they get a lot of credibility through us being complicit in making them look better. But we're not getting a lot of money from them. So we can talk more about it, but this means that it's not going to be that hard to get them out and not going to be that hard to replace their funding. It's one of the other things that I wanted to say is that I think there's a more nuanced conversation to be had for First Nations communities and First Nations artists as well, because when we're talking about the benefits of extracted wealth, that comes from First Nations people's country, and that money is owed to First Nations people. And so I respect the self-determination of those communities to choose whether or not to take that funding and what to do with that funding. But I think it's a very different conversation for those of us that are operating in non-First Nations organisations. I don't think this is a cut and dried conversation, but it's certainly something that we need to be having more of together, because it's not just about resources. It's not just about providing cover to these organisations. There's also a much harder to quantify dimension of this, and that's the editorial influence. What is it that we don't say? What is the art that we don't make? What are the conversations that we're not having when we're putting our work in spaces that are sponsored by these companies? So there's a lot for us to do. I'm really, really thrilled that the Australia Council is hosting this conversation. I think it's really good that we're starting to have this conversation at an institutional level. And as you said, this isn't about pointing fingers. This is about figuring out how we deal with the messiness of the space that we live in. We are all implicated, we are all complicit, and we are all tangled up in this. So it's about working together to detangle ourselves. So yeah, let's keep talking. I'll put some links in the chat too.
Thank you so much, Alex. And yeah, I mean, it's big and it's complex and it's intertwined. And I think it's really interesting that it's such a small percentage of organisations receiving funding from these extractive. I didn't know that. That's much smaller than I would have thought. Which
about 16% of organisations, but it accounts for less than 3% of actual money. Yeah. So yeah, this report will be coming out in a couple of weeks, and I think it's going to be very useful for us as a movement.
Absolutely. And I think, like, building off what you were saying is it's not just money at the end of the day, you know, partnerships and sponsorships, and it's also about what kind of stories we're telling and whose voice is at the table, and you know, whose voices are being heard as far as this particular topic. I think that if large festivals and cultural organizations are sponsored by these companies, you know, this is particularly devastating for First Nations communities that, you know, their country and their lands are either already have active fossil fuel, coal and gas mines on them, or they're under active exploration for, you know, new projects, which, like you were saying, that is, it's madness when we know that the global science community, you know, the latest IPCC report, it's unequivocal that the main thing we need to do is not open any new projects. Like, that's pretty clear. They're very certain about that. But if we are, you know, if exploration is then being funded, it's like, we need to kind of start to draw a line in the sand. And I think there has been a lot of movement in this space. There's been some huge kind of wins, I guess, in the last couple of months, particularly. And I mean, I'd love to jump over to you, Marie. You were kind of involved in the campaigning for fossil-free NT, to, you know, asking Darwin Festival in particular to cut ties with Santos, which they did after almost 30 years of partnership. And, you know, that was tireless work from so many First Nations communities and activists and artists, really calling for that to change. So, I mean, could you tell us a little bit about that, and also around that conversation of those who's telling these stories in this space?
Well, who's telling the stories? That's a good question. With the Darwin Festival, unfortunately, on their board, there were people who were very heavily involved in the fossil fuel industry. And so they're making really big decisions, you know, like, for instance, the chairperson. Yeah, it was hard work, but it was interesting that when we actually said, okay, we've got money to replace the $100,000 that Santos gave every year for the opening, you know, act for the Darwin Festival. So when we turned around and said, well, we've got $100,000 to replace that, they said, well, fine, we won't have an opening act at all. I mean, you know, that's not that's sort of not really achieving anything. It's sort of still at a stalemate, and it's showing that they really are not interested if we don't do what they say. You know, and speaking about, you know, like in the art centres at the remote communities, you know, a lot of times they don't know it's the person who is running the art centre that has made the decision to be funded by these people. And, you know, seeing as like we're currently under siege on the Tiwi Islands from Santos, you know, for their gas pipeline. And I know we weren't meant to be talking about that stuff, but, you know, it's it is hard to produce art when you're sort of like in a state of siege. It is hard to produce art when you can't make decisions about where that money is coming from that is going to pay you for that artwork. You know, people out there have to feed their families. People out there want culture, they want our lifestyle still, they want our land. And, you know, it's so hard when you have all these, when you have that certain pressure from these fossil fuel companies who are saying, yeah, that's right, you can do that, but you've got to take money from us, because, you know, funding in Australia for the arts is just so bad when you consider what, you know, the funding that goes into other things. You know, the arts are so terribly underfunded, and Indigenous arts, it's a struggle, you know, sometimes for those art centres to keep going to help all those artists in those remote communities. You know, they're taking a pittance for their artwork. And then when you see what the sell-on values are, you know, it's sort of like, oh goodness. And this all started out, you know, in the community where everyone just wants to be able to create and do it in a nice, sustainable way. But, you know, options are limited in big cities, let alone out there out bush, where countrymen don't have a lot of choices. So I'm lucky that I can create here, you know, at home. I've got my own space to do it. I don't have to rely on an art centre. And yeah, I'd hate to be in the position where either the art centre goes under or they accept money from a fossil fuel company. I would hate to be in that position. It's, yeah, and as, you know, you were saying before, Kelly, you know, it's a different story for, you know, for us out there in bush. You know, there's different scenarios. I'm sorry, you, Beatrice. It's a different scenario for where we are, where we live, and where we, you know, where we choose to create our work. Yeah, the Darwin Festival stuff, I'd like to say this here, I probably shouldn't, but I was just so very proud of Leah Purcell standing up and letting people know that that opening festival was funded by Santos. A lot of people didn't know that, you know, so it's getting that information out there, is educating people and letting people sort of like know and understand, you know, where these, because a lot of time we're ignorant to that. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors, you know, in committee meetings. You know, people didn't realise what the Darwin Festival committee, you know, what the board was doing. It was just like, hey, look at this great festival. And I'm so happy that so many people stood up and said, this is wrong, this is absolutely wrong. And, you know, we don't want their money, even if we have to do without an opening thing, which we're doing now, because of the bloody mindedness of, you know, the board. Like, okay, we won't even accept good money. If we can't have any Santos, if we can't have any fossil fuel money, we don't want to do it at all. I mean, that is so childish. I cannot believe how childish, you know, what it's descended to. So I'd like to, you know, that board should consist of more Indigenous people. There's one lady, but I think she's from New South Wales, you know, so she can't speak for my country here. She can't speak for us. And they think that counts, you know, like we're all one big black happy family, you know. No, hello. It's not, doesn't work like that. And I just wish that we weren't so poor. I wish that some of, you know, the wealth of this country, we could even get a tiny percentage of, so that, you know, because money is power. And if we had some of the, you know, if we could make better decisions if we had the money to do it, you know, like from these mining companies and that, because sometimes, you know, what they're doing, we don't have a choice in it. So if that's going to happen, you know, like the fracking now is going to go ahead, you know, then we should get a lot more than what we're getting. Yeah, we're getting nothing. Where's all that money going to? Where's it going? You know, is it supporting the royal family in England? You know, is it supporting the government here? We're not seeing anything. And if we had more choices, if we had more money, we would have more choices. We'd have more options. Yeah, we could we could make things a lot better than what they are, instead of just, it's like the old days when we just got given a bag of flour and got patted on the head and said, yeah, thanks for your day's work. Well, it's still like that. Nothing has changed. Colonialism is not dead. And I tell you, it still exists now, even in the arts industry. Yeah, it's a fight, it's a struggle. And I'm just so fortunate to be where I am and to be able to speak, because some countrymen don't even know where to start. They don't even know where to begin. They don't even know who to say, why are you doing this? This is wrong. Yeah, so yeah, I just wish that we were in a better position. And, I think the more that we talk about it, the more that people understand what's going on, because, the public are totally, possibly totally unaware, like we are too, out in the remote communities, I think a lot of people are just, supporting these things out of ignorance, because they don't realise what's going on and the damage to our land and our culture and to our ability to create our artworks. They don't understand those little things that are happening behind the scenes for us. But
yeah,
the more that people are educated, the more that it gets out there, the better. And I think these webinars are a fabulous way of doing it.
absolutely. Thank you so much, Marie. And I think you made so many amazing points that, like, it's, if an artist, especially First Nations artists, have to choose between, showcasing their work in these large institutions or not, and that's down to funding or who's partnering with those large companies. And it is linked up to choice and access and opportunity as well. Your money is power, and if that money is coming from a power that has a different kind of influence, then yeah, it's really, really tricky. And I think when it falls on the shoulders of independent artists or, smaller producers or people really already struggling to get by or showcase their work, that's a whole nother conversation. So I think it really is about having these conversations and taking leadership and responsibility in this space is really, really critical moving forwards. But also, sharing some of that as well, because these are complex challenges, but they're also collective challenges, and really supporting each other as we navigate that space, I think is key. And Kelly, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your work in this space, kind of shifting the conversation a little bit to what we can do in a way, I guess. There's a bunch of kind of great case studies or wins, for lack of a better word, that we've seen over the last couple of months, but there's still a lot of work to do. So really, anyone listening today, I think to round out the conversation, both with yourself and then Lana and Eliki, is some practical actions that we can take, or examples of what, change looks like within our industry. You're the co-founder of PVI Collective, which you gave a bit of context to, but PVI really stands out in WA as one of the only arts organisations that actually refuses money from coal, oil and gas. And you've also recently developed a wonderful code of ethics, which has a template people can use. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that and what that process looked like and what it's looked like since.
Sure. Thanks, Beatrice. Thanks, everyone. And I think it's so great to be having this conversation, and kudos to OzCo for taking it on, because it is a heavy one. It is a hard one. It is complex. And we have felt quite alone, actually, in Boorloo in particular. You just need to look at our city skyline here to see who actually runs this town. And, it's very kind of muddy, the distinction between where the fossil fuel industry ends and where our state government begins. And I think for us, with developing the code of ethics, it really was trying to empower ourselves and other artists who were deeply concerned about the enormous power and influence that the fossil fuel industry has on the arts, and really kind of asking that question, well, how can we make work that's agitating in this space whilst being funded or sponsored by those very organizations. And so I think I did want to just jump back a little bit with the Code of Ethics, because it came about really in 2014 when the Sydney Biennale boycott, the artists there successfully campaigned to have to boycott. They boycotted the festival because of Transfield's association with the Biennale. Transfield, as we know, were heavily involved in profiting from the offshore detention of asylum seekers. And I think at the time, artists were really hauled over the coals in the political sphere for critiquing this and for pushing this, and were, kind of punished in a way. And I think the PM at the time, Turnbull at the time, accused us of vicious ingratitude. How dare we refuse corporate sponsorship? And I think at the time, this was a massive lightning bolt moment for independent artists, because it really, the threat that came afterwards, the threat of our then arts minister to, try to push the Australia Council to come up with policy that would actually prohibit artists from refusing to accept corporate sponsorship on ethical grounds. And I think at the time for us back then, it was, well, if they're going to develop policy, then maybe we should develop policy of our own that actually aligns our ethics and values with partners of choice. And so it kind of really was the seeds were sown there. And once again, I think it was the artists who kind of suffered at the hands of sticking their necks out and kind of going, this is wrong. So what we tried to do, jumping forward to 2022, we do have a Code of Ethics template, which you can just jump on our website and download it and input into it, make it better, make it work for you. But it really is looking at kind of, where do we draw the line? Where do we draw the line in terms of accepting money from corporate sponsors? I think for us, it was that realization that really is our ethics and our values that drive our art making. So we really need to honor that and to have it forward facing. So I think that's kind of where it started. It felt like a tiny offering, but also I think it really helped to kind of anchor us back and give some decision-making power and control back into the artist's hands to kind of go, well, okay, here's where we stand. Here's the kind of partners that we would be looking, ideally to want to work with. And here's where we draw the line against, who we won't work with. So it really was an attempt to try to counter that kind of silencing of particularly independent artists who were grappling with, and still are grappling with, the problems of this. I would also like to cite Gabrielle de Vietry's Maps of Gratitude, Cones of Silence, Lumps of Coal, which I feel like was this incredible parting gift from an artist who had been able to kind of map and track the depth of how the fossil fuel industry is baked into our cultural infrastructure. And I feel like for Gabrielle, it was a parting gift of like, look at this mess that we're in. I can't work in this space, and has since gone on to, become a Greens MP. But the legacy of that lives on, and the power of making that work that showed us directly how, tangled, as Alex mentioned, it is a tangled web, and one that we need to be able to talk about and confront. So I guess that's where the Code of Ethics came from. It's just about, and I think anyone can have a code of ethics. You don't have to have a corporate infrastructure or be a company to be able to state boldly to the world, this is where I stand, this is what I believe in, here's what drives, the art that we make. I think anyone can do that. And so it really was an attempt to try to put that out there and offer it out as something that could be shared as a resource that other people could improve upon and build upon.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. And congrats on putting that out into the world and developing it. I think it can often be quite a process. But I mean, this is about authentically being connected to our ethics as well, right? And if whether it's your personal bank or super, and making sure that your money, where it's going to and coming from, is aligned with your values of whether it be a safe climate future or, protecting First Nations communities. I think because this stuff can often sometimes be case by case as well, partners come and go, having a code of ethics or something that draws a line in the sand to say, this is what we support, this is what we feel like is valuable as a company or an artist, and to really put some time into thinking about that as well, but then also having it on paper and kind of being like, this is our plan. This is, it might change a little bit here and there, but I'd encourage everyone to have a look at that template. And, if you're an independent artist, if you're an organization, just jump on it and get started, because it doesn't have to be perfect, but we really need to start having these conversations in organizations across Australia. I think we're far behind in some aspects, and this kind of way forwards is a bit overdue. But there are other ways that we can take action, and I think start to implement these kinds of solutions. And again, going back to that point of doing that together, I think, and navigating the complexities of this topic together is really important. So Eliki and Lana, I'd love to hand over to you both now to hear about the wonderful initiative that you've only just launched last week, which is super exciting. So congrats. And this is called A Climate for Art. And it's really a way, I guess, to help support the sector move together on this. The website's got tools and resources and guides and templates. And I'd love you to speak a little bit more to that, and also maybe provide some ways that people listening today can start to incorporate that.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, kind of riffing off a lot of the points that everyone shared today from, we were concerned with, I guess, like the seat of power and what we can do kind of as artists, as PBI Collective has sort of shown. But what Lana and I were concerned with as independent producers was like our proximity to power with organizations sort of bringing us on as subcontractors, and what sort of influence, what realm of influence we had. And we both will, I won't speak for Lana, but like we're very focused on climate change and its impacts. For me, coming from the Pacific Islands and from Fiji specifically, what I do in this context impacts what happens back home. And so there is a lot of programming that's happening definitely within our context in Melbourne around the climate change and its impacts, but that's all programmed, and how can that be reflected in the operations of organizations here?
Yeah, I think we were hearing the artistic voice as the sort of like show of the ethics of an organization, but it wasn't necessarily being reflected in the structures. And so we were really asking organizations to take that extra step. But I think also why it's called A Climate for Art is because we can see sort of like Marie mentioned, like when you're in those places of being under siege, or not being able to breathe, or if you have family overseas that are going through this, all of those things impact our ability to really flourish and make art in the ways that we want to. So yeah, I guess we're also reluctant climate activists, but we see this as the crisis of our time. And if we're really listening to the context of what's happening in the world, which I think is what art best does, this is what we need to be doing. And so we really like encourage OzCo and Creative Victoria and all funding bodies to also fund this work as artwork as well, because that's been something we've really come into friction with through this process. But yeah, I guess we were both working from our seats of power and really thinking about what are the gears that we could shift to work towards things. And we looked at divestment because I think it's a really clear way to look at, what are the structures that we sort of unbeknowingly support, and what do those structures support? And a lot of those link back to Santos or the Bora Pub, or, what are these banks that we're funding actually funding with our money. And that goes with superannuation and power as well. So they felt like 3 sort of clear steps that we could gather around. But we also know that it's not about divesting and just going on as normal. And that's why we've also created the Climate Union, because we want these bigger conversations around climate justice, but also, you know, deep paradigm shift rather than just business as usual, but with a green wash over the top.
Because we're well aware that, you know, the eco side is a cultural issue as well, and so kind of seated within the arts and cultural industry, we believe that we hold like the vision and the power and the ability to collectivize to actually redress these issues at hand and all of the things that feed into this ongoing, I guess, power dilemma.
And when we look at divesting, we also have the conversation about what we invest in. And I think a lot of that we really hope will be, First Nations, led projects and, governance in our organisations that can help heal country. And I think we're really asking organisations as well, what is the responsibility to the land that you're on, and taking those actions further. So that's all sort of what we're working towards, hopefully. And we're also don't want to lead this project. We want it to be a community-led project. So I think the union, we're trying to work out, how can we have these conversations be led by everyone who's involved in them? Because I think we have a lot of ways of looking at governance from our government and our school systems that we just look to leaders to change things, and we're really interested in a different mode of leadership that comes as a collective force.
Great, thanks so much, guys. And yeah, congrats again on launching. I think it's a really exciting step in the right direction to have that collective feel around it all. And I mean, it is like, it makes you it's empowering to know that you can directly affect, like we see in the news, it's like, new coal mine or environmental destruction, and I think unfortunately a lot of us are experiencing that in the forefront now as well around Australia with, weather events, but sometimes you do feel a bit helpless, or you don't know how you can directly influence that decision making that'll, make those big structural changes that we need to happen. And on a personal finance perspective, switching your bank and super, but then also reaching out to these institutions or organizations to tell them why can be a really powerful step to help influence that. For a lot of people, super is going to be one of the biggest wealth pools that we have in our life. And if that money isn't aligned with our values or our ethics, like you said, investment, it's not only divesting from extractive industries, environmental destruction, coal, oil and gas projects, on this transition, like we need to transition. It's can't happen overnight, but those funds are then going towards climate solutions, renewable energy, social housing, planting trees. I think money is power, and if we can help influence those decisions, then that feels really empowering. So thank you everyone for your wonderful wisdom and knowledge and having this conversation with us today. We do have some time for questions, so in a moment I will jump to that, but I would like first to just circulate back to each of our speakers today to, I guess, provide a bit of a summary or an action piece that we can all take. It's been a bit of a theme across this webinar series, is really coming together on this stuff and, a few action pieces or something we feel like we can do. So I'll jump back to Alex first.
I think building a process around whether it's a code of ethics, but also around an ethical sponsorship framework is a really useful thing for an organisation to do, because it's one of those things where people assume that there's consensus. Oh, well, we wouldn't take money from bioweapons companies, or we wouldn't take money from tobacco, but actually, because, and that's why Maps of Gratitude is so great. When we see how messy the web is, actually, we might be taking money from a subsidiary of a weapons company. We just hadn't clocked it. And that was one of the questions that came through in the Q&A, like, how are we to know which banks and corporations and organizations are ethical? And it's hard. There's not really a one-stop shop yet. There's different organisations like Market Forces and 350.org and others that look at across organisations, but the process of going through putting together an ethical sponsorship framework, I think, is a really beneficial one. And Kate raised in the questions as well the question of duty of care to staff. And I think actually it's one of those containers that you can set up in an organisation that when you're talking about ethical sponsorship, it can also not just be about the optics, how do we look, is this bad for our brand if we're associated with these companies, but also the internal values in the organisation and how those align with who you are taking money from. And also to name where things are sticky and compromised, but you need to make those compromises. I think that's the other thing about this whole conversation. Like, if we can be more transparent with each other, it'll be easier to have conversations about all the ways in which we're all implicated, without it necessarily being that we're all pretending that we're clean, because we're not. We live in an inherently corrupt system. So we can't be perfect and pure within that system. So I think the other thing is, once you've done a process of an ethical sponsorship development, then you can do the harder step, which is saying no to things, reversing things, rejecting things, speaking out against things. It gives you a basis to take that next step, rather than expecting to suddenly just jump into activism without having done that thorough piece of work internally. And I think more and more organisations across the continent are starting to do this. So find each other is my other tip. Like, don't feel like it's all on you. Look for the others.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alex. I think, starting often a thing that's happening now, I think in our industry, is people like green teams or sustainability committees or action groups of employees within an organization that are really looking to make changes. And I think, that's a way that might be helpful for people, if you're in an organization, is starting the conversation and saying, hey, look, I don't quite know how to navigate this, but here's some great resources we can get started on, or reach out, because people have moved through big complex challenges like this before, and maybe there's support there or guidance. But yeah, thank you, Alex. That's a great one. I will hand over to Kelly now.
Thank you. Oh yeah, just completely agree with everything Alex has said, or what everyone is saying. Really, I think the important thing for us to realize was that we're not alone in this, that there are other artists, there are other organizations, there are audiences who are also questioning this. And I don't know whether this is particularly a Boogaloo-based observation, maybe because it just feels like we're right in the lion's den here, that audiences are starting to clock, the cultural events or the festivals or exhibitions that they are going to, who the signage is, who the major sponsors are. They are starting to question that and go, well, why would I, if I'm taking my teenage child to, the climate protest, why would I then attend this festival who is sponsored and supported by this very fossil fuel organization? So I think that those links are starting to happen. And I think the powerful thing that the arts can do in this space is that we can connect the climate science with the emotional weight of the climate crisis that we face. Like, we can be really powerful in this space, and to remember that we might not have the money, but we do have cultural influence and power. So I guess that's another thing to bear in mind. Just looking at the Q&A where Kate's asked about examples of duty of care to staff. I think this is a really tricky thing in terms of, if we're having to have difficult conversations as a company, as an arts collective, we need to be able to talk to each other openly and honestly about where we stand. And I really appreciate what you were saying, Alex, about we assume that we all have the same ethics, and sometimes we don't. So we need to kind of bash that out internally. And we also have a duty of care to our audiences, so why would they come and see a work that you know is supported by the fossil fuel industry. Another thing I would just advise, and we've gone into this spiral of kind of dirty money, what is clean money? I think that you can end up chasing your tail on this, and what has helped us is to kind of really acknowledge that it's fossil fuels first. Like, this is the urgent step and transition that we need to take. It's fossil fuels first. That yes, there's a lot of dirty money out there, and we can talk about gambling, and we can talk about, you know, AGI and all of that, but fossil fuels first. Start there.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. It's such a good point to make, that this stuff is hard and funding is hard, and we're an underfunded industry, that starting where we're going to have the most impact, which is that power that we have and that cultural influence, and fossils first. That's a good tagline. And, you know, I mean, we're artists and we're creative, but this is what the science is saying, and scientists are really good at figuring out, you know, the science of the matter. So it's really their job to tell us what we need to do, and then communicating that and taking that and bringing it in towards our practice and how we operate, how we program, is really, I think, our role to play in this space. Marie, I'll hand over to you.
Well, yeah, what Alex was saying, once again, yeah, what else can I add to that? But I think this ethical sponsorship is really, really important, you know, that we need to fight, because I'm not saying that we give in to these, you know, these fossil fuel companies who come on our lands and try, but, you know, we need to be prepared. And they're like, you know, I was shocked when that fracking stuff went through. So, you know, we need to be prepared and be able to say, okay, you know what, if you're going to do this is how we are going to do it. You know, you don't make the rules, we do. You know, we're going to make sure that we can make this as good for us as we possibly can, because, you know, so far we haven't had, yeah, we've been left defenseless, and need to be prepared, I think, for the future. And as I said, it's not like rolling over and giving in, but it's being prepared. And if we find ourselves in that position, we can call the shots, you know, in these remote areas, for these remote area artists who never have a voice, you know, very rarely.
Thanks, Marie. And yeah, I think there's a responsibility here, right, to do the right thing and support people that need it, and yeah. That's why we're transitioning. You know, it's going to be a journey. It's going to be bumpy and not black and white and streamlined. There's no silver bullet, but it's just part of being a good human on this planet, is caring for country, caring for the communities that need you know, support, and each other, and you know, having compassion as well in a lot of these conversations, but really making sure we have having these conversations.
And also, I'm really interested to read, Kelly, the code of ethics. That would be really exciting, because, you know, we've been waiting too long for something like that. Yeah.
Thanks, Marie. I will just quickly say there are like some support documents that are really kind of worth having a look at if you're not sure if it's right for you or what you do with it. There's some little support documents as well that kind of gets you to step through some questions to ask yourself, and that's always super handy.
Oh, that's fabulous. Thank you.
And there's a few questions coming through around resources, and I just thought it's worth mentioning that we will have a bunch of resources and links and tools on the Australia Council website that will, you know, get out in the next couple of weeks, which is a really great place to start with all of these links. So you can copy and paste them from the chat, but we will make those available. Okay, I'll hand over to Eliki and Lana.
Yeah, I think a big conversation that we had at our first Climate Union meeting was, how do we make the time for this? And a big conversation was, can we write this into our strategic plan? So I think as organisations, that's something that we definitely advocate for people to do, because in terms of staff welfare, like the question in the Q&A, we need to make sure that we don't feel like this is an extra add-on, that this is part of like the central mechanism of an organisation. I think there's also the question of streamlining of tools and resources, which is definitely what we're trying to do in our organisation by putting things on the website, but also by creating collectives within our Climate Union to assist each other in the writing of things like strategic plans. But I think also I think a big question for me is how do we create these spaces of listening to be able to work out where the ecology is broken? And definitely Eliki and I were looking at a lot of artwork and seeing that a lot of it was sort of on the, around consciousness raising or things like that. But were we giving tools to audiences to then take those stories to implement those things in their own lives? I think that was a really big question. And yeah, like what sort of spaces do we have for programming and research around climate? How can we also make sure that that's at the top of our agenda? And yeah, I guess we also wanted to talk about science, because while it is really important as a leader in this space, we also think First Nations people have been telling us for a really long time about these issues. And I think it's really important to have those walk side by side.
It's pattern thinking, it's the first sciences of the land, it's like directly responsive. And so being able to like follow that is probably a good position to take going forward, I would say, quite lightly. But
a big question, has been how do we listen? That's the, I think even in the way that we work together, we're like, how do we begin to listen to what we need in these spaces? How do we listen to what is happening in the ecology?
And I guess, kind of riffing off the space that we're talking about for burnout, and as you sort of mentioned, I guess our method's just each one teach one, open source learning. Like, we don't need to hoard any of these ideas. It's better for us all if we're all just sharing the ideas that we come up together with.
But also, I think also the space of independence is really important, because I feel like if we were tied to organisations in particular ways, it would be very hard for us to do the work that we're doing. And so how can we fund more parasitic to institutional work, or work that sort of moves power away from those typical centres and can change the conversation through that.
That's us.
So much. I mean, that's a wonderful way to round out this conversation, particularly talk about money, but climate and environment in general is listening. And First Nations people right across the world have cared for country in a way that has been truly sustainable, when we use that word. And it's really about coming back to that and centering that knowledge and that wisdom and walking alongside each other as we move to a better world. I think often sometimes in the climate conversation, the solutions are real like tech or, net zero or targets or Excel spreadsheets or renewable energy is going to save the world, and like a lot of that stuff is important and a part of the conversation and a part of change, but start by stopping as well and listening and doing less sometimes, in a way, like consuming less and slowing down. And I know that's easy to say, but I think linking back to the topic of money and sponsorship and funding and, switching your money or moving whether it's personal finances or larger organizational finances, like I was saying, feels really empowering, but it's also pretty quick and easy. Like when you break it down, 20 minutes of admin and you can make a switch, you can get in touch, you can have these conversations. It's a long, road, but it's kind of a bang for your buck climate win sometimes. Obviously that looks different to everyone, but I think that's it for today. Thank you everyone so much for your time and for dialing in to listen to this today. It's a big conversation, and I also really want to say thank you so much to all of our wonderful speakers for having the time and wisdom and sharing your experience in this space. It's hard, and so thank you for showing leadership and compassion and putting your energy into this. I think the reluctant activist is kind of a good way to frame it. But there's exciting change happening, and I think the more we can support each other through that, the better. So thanks again. Thank you, Australia Council, for hosting these sessions. They will all be online, and hopefully we'll have many more conversations like this until we don't have to. But yeah, cool. Thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye everyone.
Bye, thank you.